Morning, everyone. This morning is for our Bible reading. We've read 1 Corinthians 14, verse 20 to 40. And I thought it might be helpful, since this passage says some arguably quite confusing, maybe even offensive things. I thought it might be helpful to offer some words by way of explanation to help us understand what Paul's saying here. The passage in particular that I'm referring to is 1 Corinthians 14, verse 33b onto 35, where it says, "As in all the churches of the saints, the women should keep silent in the churches, for they're not permitted to speak, but should be in submission, as the law also says. If there's anything they desire to learn, let them ask their husbands at home, for it's shameful for a woman to speak in church." Strong words, confusing words. Like I said, arguably offensive words, and for some people they think, this confirms, as some people in my culture say, this confirms that the Apostle Paul is sexist or misogynistic, or that churches are places where women are subjugated and oppressed by men. Well, let's look at the text together and let's look at what Paul's actually saying. We trust the sovereignty of God, and we trust the Spirit's inspiration of Paul in writing these words. And so we sit under it, we receive it, we don't judge it and lord over it, but instead we have to be careful in asking what God is wanting to say to us through this text. Now, if we only ever read the Bible for like espresso shots of platitudes, fridge magnets, we'll skip over hard to understand parts. But instead, if we mine them, and as careful Bible students who receive them as God's word, which is what I think we should do, then I think we'll be enriched. Our lives will be enriched by it. Now, a few things. In this passage, in this immediate context, Paul has addressed, before he talks about women, he's already addressed two types of public speakers in the church, and he's given them instructions on when they should speak, when they should be silent. He's given them instructions on the distinction between public speech and private speech, and he's told them that all things need to be done in accordance with the order and honour of God, with that in mind. The guiding principle for this passage is let all things be done for building up. And that's, arguably what Paul's addressing in the letter. He's addressing a church where people aren't doing things for the building up of one another. They're doing it for, various other reasons, competitiveness or ego, trying to impress one another, outdo one another, etc. Getting drunk at communion and lording it over one another, neglecting the poor among them, etc. So when he says let all things be done for the building up, and then he's going to come on to talk about three types of speakers in the church, that's his motivation. There are some of you in the church who are not using your public speech to do this. So let's correct it. Tongue speakers, he says, if there is no one to interpret, let him keep silent in the church, in public, but should speak to himself and to God. Then, when he talks about prophecy, he says, if a revelation is made to someone else, then let the first be silent, is our word again. You can all prophesy one by one. So you may learn and be encouraged, is our guiding principle. Then he says, for God is not a God of confusion, but of peace. And those two ideas of public and private, and God is a God of not of confusion, but of peace, will reoccur as he then talks about women. So that's our first observation, that there is a distinction between public and private, and times of speaking and times of silence, not just for women, but for tongue speakers and for prophesiers. Now, I've been saying for women, but actually I think it's clear, not just from this passage, but from the context as a whole. He's not talking about women as a blanket class in general, but some women in particular, it seems. He says the women, rather than women, all women, for example. But just in verse 26, he says, when you come together, each one of you has a hymn, a lesson, a revelation, a tongue, or an interpretation. He says, each one of you has. He doesn't say, the men have. Each one of you has. That's the first thing to point out. The other thing to point out is that just 2 chapters earlier, or 3 chapters earlier in 1 Corinthians 11, in the passage where Paul's addressing head coverings, or talking about head coverings and praying in public, his expectation is women and men are both praying in public in the gathered church, and in that section his concern is with ensuring that it is done in an honourable way, based on some of their cultural norms and based on some of scriptural principles. that is Paul's guiding principle here. He's concerned that public speech in the church is done in an honourable way. And whenever Paul talks about men and women, he doesn't make reference to cultural stereotypes. Instead, he makes reference to created order. Paul, calling traditional, believes that there's a distinction between men and women. And so when he says in verse 34, he says, women should be in submission as the law also says. Now, there's no Old Testament law in the book of Moses that he's referring to. So what Bible commentators say here is that Paul is making reference to the created law, as the law says. In other words, there are some guiding principles of distinction and difference between men and women. And so he uses the created law, the distinction between men and women, to show them how to display some of their masculinity and their femininity in public and in the church, because the church is the new humanity on display. And what he wants to see is men, when he talks to them, that they must be laying their lives down in service and sacrifice for women. Although actually it's not just not really for women per se, but for their wives in that particular reference. He's talking to husbands. Women should show respect and honour. And some have also said the reason for writing this is because he's writing to a church where women, because of their newfound freedoms and liberation in Christ, are stepping beyond the boundaries of decency and social decency and bringing some public shame on the church, as people are gossiping and talking about what's happening in the church because of the licentiousness and the freedoms of affection and of honour between the men and the women. And so there's lots of things going on in this passage and in the culture as a whole. And Paul's concern is that let everything be done for both building one another up and to display God as a God of order and not of chaos. And actually then as actors in the world, tongue speakers, prophets, men and women, we also should aim to ensure that all of our speech is done for the building up of one another and to display the good created order and honour that God has made the world in, rather than trying to subvert, undermine or blur the boundaries and distinctions between the things that God's created. Those are some words. I hope they brought some level of clarity to what might be a confusing passage for you. Have a great day.